This is a conspiracy so massive, so coordinated, that it involved hundreds of thousands of soldiers, spanned an entire subcontinent, and came within inches of completely rewriting world history. The British called it a mutiny, but it was so much more than that. This is the story of how chapatis, greased cartridges, and a brilliant underground network nearly toppled the most powerful empire on Earth. Act 1. The setup, 0:20 to 3 o'clock. So let me set the scene for you. It's 1856, and Britain basically owns India through the East India Company. They've got 45,000 British troops controlling a population of 200 million people. Those odds sound insane, right? But here's how they did it. They recruited Indian soldiers called sepoys, nearly 250,000 of them. These weren't just random recruits. These were professional soldiers, many from warrior castes with generations of military tradition. The British trained them, armed them, and basically relied on them to hold their entire empire together. Therefore, the sepoys were the spine of British power in India. Now, the British made a critical mistake. They assumed loyalty was automatic. They thought as long as they paid decent wages and maintained some military prestige, these soldiers would stay in line forever. But they completely misread the room. See, there was this growing resentment simmering beneath the surface. The British were aggressive about westernizing India, banning traditional practices, imposing Christianity, disrespecting local customs. They even had this policy called the Doctrine of Lapse, where they'd basically steal kingdoms if a ruler died without a direct heir. Every move felt like an attack on Indian culture. Therefore, by 1857, you had 250,000 trained, armed soldiers who were getting increasingly pissed off. And then the British handed them the perfect spark to light the whole thing on fire. Act 2. The conspiracy begins, 3 to 7 o'clock. Here's where it gets wild. In early 1857, the British introduced a new rifle, the Enfield Pattern 1853. Better range, better accuracy, exactly what you'd want in your army. But there was one small problem. To load this rifle, soldiers had to bite open a paper cartridge. And the rumor started spreading that these cartridges were greased with beef and pork fat. Now, if you're not familiar, that's basically the worst possible combination. Beef fat is sacred to Hindus. Pork is forbidden to Muslims. The British had literally managed to offend both major religions simultaneously with a single piece of ammunition. But here's what makes this more than just a religious controversy. Some historians believe this wasn't just an accident or a stupid oversight. There's evidence suggesting that someone deliberately spread this rumor as part of a coordinated plan. These whispers didn't just randomly appear. They moved systematically through the ranks, hitting multiple regiments at the same time. Therefore, somebody was organizing this. And then there's the mystery of the chapatis. This is one of the weirdest parts of the whole story. In the months leading up to May 1857, thousands of chapatis, these unleavened Indian flatbreads, started mysteriously moving from village to village across northern India. A runner would show up at night, hand over these chapatis to the village watchman, and tell him to make more and pass them to the next village. Nobody knew what it meant. Even the British noticed it happening but couldn't figure it out. Some people think it was a coded message system. Others believe it was a way to create anxiety and anticipation. Whatever it was, it worked. Therefore, you had this invisible network coordinating across hundreds of miles. The most fascinating part? We still don't know exactly who masterminded this. But we do know it worked. Act 3. The explosion, 7 to 11 o'clock. May 10, 1857. Meerut Cantonment. 85 sepoys had refused to use the controversial cartridges. The British court-martialed them, stripped them of their uniforms in front of their fellow soldiers, and sentenced them to 10 years of hard labor in chains. Imagine that scene. These are respected soldiers, some with decades of service, being publicly humiliated in front of thousands of their comrades. But the British thought this would intimidate everyone into compliance. Instead, it was the final insult. The next evening, 3 regiments of sepoys mutinied. They broke their imprisoned comrades out of jail, killed their British officers, and then did something that shows you this wasn't just a spontaneous riot. They marched 40 miles overnight to Delhi. Think about that. A 40-mile forced march in the dark, staying in formation with a clear objective. That's military planning. Therefore, when they arrived at Delhi at dawn, they weren't a mob, they were an army. And they went straight to the last Mughal emperor, Bahadur Shah Zafar, an 82-year-old poet living in the Red Fort with basically zero political power. The sepoys declared him their leader and pronounced the restoration of Mughal rule. But here's the genius of this move. By rallying around the Mughal emperor, they weren't just rebelling, they were offering an alternative. They gave Hindus, Muslims, and everyone else a symbolic figurehead that represented pre-British India. They created legitimacy for their uprising. Within weeks, the rebellion spread like wildfire. Regiments mutinied in Lucknow, Jhansi, Kanpur, and dozens of other cities. The British lost control of huge chunks of northern India virtually overnight. Therefore, by June 1857, the British Empire was actually losing. At Kanpur, the siege lasted 3 weeks before British forces surrendered. At Lucknow, British civilians and loyal troops were trapped for 5 months in the Residency, under constant attack. Run. Act 4. Why it failed. 11 to 1500 hours. So if the rebels had momentum, military strength, and popular support, why didn't they win? 3 reasons. First, coordination problems. While the conspiracy to start the uprising was brilliant, sustaining it across such a massive area was almost impossible with 1857 technology. Different regions had different leaders with different agendas. Some wanted to restore the Mughals. Others wanted regional independence. Some were fighting for religious reasons. Others for political ones. Therefore, they never formed a unified command structure. Second, not everyone joined. This is crucial. Southern and eastern India largely stayed loyal to the British. The Sikh regiments in Punjab, who had their own beef with the Mughals, actually fought for the British. The Gurkhas stayed loyal. Even among the sepoys, it wasn't universal. Roughly half remained with the East India Company. But the third reason is the most important. The British were absolutely savage in their counterattack. They brought in reinforcements from Britain. They executed prisoners without trial. They literally tied rebels to cannons and blew them apart. A punishment called blowing from a gun. They burned entire villages. The reprisals were so brutal that even some British officials were horrified. This wasn't just military strategy. This was terror designed to break the spirit of resistance. Therefore, by mid-1858, the rebellion was crushed. Bahadur Shah Zafar was captured, tried for treason, and exiled to Burma, where he died in 1862. The last Mughal emperor ended his life as a prisoner, writing poetry about his lost kingdom. The British executed tens of thousands of rebels. They confiscated massive amounts of land. And they made sure everyone knew the cost of rebellion. But here's the thing, the British actually lost. Act 5. The aftermath, 15 to 1800 hours. See, even though the British militarily won, the uprising fundamentally changed everything. The British government dissolved the East India Company completely. After 258 years of corporate rule over India, the British Crown took direct control. Queen Victoria became Empress of India. The whole system got restructured. Therefore, the rebels actually destroyed the entity they were fighting against. More importantly, it shattered the British myth of invincibility. Before 1857, the British thought they could control India indefinitely with relatively few troops and smart administration. After 1857, they knew they were ruling over people who could coordinate, fight, and nearly win. The seeds of Indian nationalism were planted in this rebellion. The idea that Indians from different religions, regions, and backgrounds could unite against colonial rule, that concept survived the military defeat. But what really blows my mind is how close this actually came to succeeding. If the rebels had better coordination, if more regions had joined simultaneously, if the British hadn't had loyal troops to draw from, the outcome could have been completely different. Imagine a world where the British Empire collapsed in 1857. No British India means no partition of India and Pakistan in 1947. No partition means potentially no wars over Kashmir. The entire trajectory of South Asian history, maybe even world history, changes. Therefore, this wasn't just a failed rebellion. This was a near-miss catastrophe for Britain that almost rewrote the 20th century before it even started. Closing, 18 to 2000 hours. The 1857 uprising shows you something fascinating about power. The British controlled India with a tiny fraction of troops by relying on Indian soldiers. Their whole system was built on this assumption that they could maintain loyalty through paychecks and prestige. But when you disrespect people's culture, religion, and dignity enough times, no amount of money matters. Somebody, and we still don't fully know who, figured out how to weaponize that resentment. They used chapatis, rumors, and careful timing to coordinate a massive uprising across thousands of miles with no phones, no internet, no modern communication. That's organizational genius. The British won the military battle but lost the psychological war. They spent the next 90 years afraid of another uprising, which is exactly what eventually happened, except the next time it was led by lawyers, activists, and peaceful protesters instead of soldiers. Mahatma Gandhi, Jawaharlal Nehru, and the Indian independence movement learned from 1857. They built a more sustainable resistance, one that the British couldn't just crush with military force. Therefore, the rebellion of 1857 was actually the beginning of the end for the British Empire in India. It just took another 90 years to finish the job. So that's the story of the secret plan that almost destroyed the British Empire. A conspiracy built on chapatis, rumors, and the systematic disrespect of 250,000 armed soldiers who decided they'd had enough. If you found this fascinating, let me know what historical near-misses you want me to cover next. There are dozens of moments where history almost went in a completely different direction. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.